teenagers on television. It's a hot topic. Now, young adult TV shows have garnered a bit of a reputation for casting actors that are significantly older than their teenaged characters that they're playing, often to a comical degree. Like, this man is supposed to be 17 years old, and this is his 25-year-old brother. I mean, like, this is a real 25-year-old. This is a TV 25-year-old. In reality, these gentlemen were 27 and 30 years old respectively when they filmed the first season of The Vampire Diaries, and considering that they were playing vampires frozen in time, this ridiculous age discrepancy only got more ridiculous throughout the seasons. I think we can all see how absurd this is, and recently people have been pointing out some of the more sinister consequences of this phenomenon. In a nutshell, the observations are that casting adults to play teenagers gives the actual teenagers watching them an unrealistic idea of how they should look and act. Not to mention the implications of having those teenage characters engage in sexually explicit activities. As someone who was once a teenage girl who consumed this media, I can personally attest to the fact that my self-image was and kind of still is warped by watching full-grown adults with porcelain skin and full-bodied curves pretend to be teenagers. These dangers have been discussed by pretty much every commentary channel on YouTube, but they rarely propose an actionable solution to the problem. So today I'd like to go through a few examples and talk about what might work and what might actually make things worse. So the obvious solution to unrealistic casting would be realistic casting, and this does solve the main issue of teenagers seeing themselves represented. Just look at a show like Skins. It's an incredibly well-loved and well-respected show that many teenagers connected with, in part because they actually saw themselves in the characters. This is especially true for queer teenagers who got to see LGBTQ characters on screen in a time when the pickings were even slimmer than they are now. And most of that representation was done really well. The Skins actors were all teenagers who were very close in age to the characters that they were playing, which led to a lot more authentic performances, which is great. But then the problems begin. Skins is a pretty raunchy show. There's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, if you will. While it's true that some teenagers engage in these activities, I would argue it's not the majority, and there's a difference between being realistic and glorifying harmful behavior. It also contributes to this societal misconception that teenagers are more adult than they actually are, and this leads to people mistreating teenagers in real life. April Pearson, who played Michelle in Generation 1 of Skins, has an Instagram live show / podcast where she interviews people who are closely associated with one character about how that association has affected their lives. She's interviewed a ton of people, including Oliver and James Phelps, Sharon Rooney, Ivana Lynch, but she's also interviewed a lot of her Skins alumni, and the shared experiences that they've expressed have been, well, as Dan Pfeiffer would say, shocking but not surprising. I would especially recommend listening to her episode with Dakota Blue Richards, who played Frankie in Generation 3. This character is a highly controversial one, and just listening to Dakota's experience playing Frankie makes your blood boil.
We all had to do basically like a bikini parade for Brian, who had come back at this point, because we were all going to be in like swimwear for the whole first episode pretty much, and you know they needed to okay what we were going to be wearing. And they had picked for me one of those like striped, almost like Victorian, like a sort of play suit, swimsuit with like shorts and sleeves.
I know the one, yeah.
Yeah, which I thought was absolutely, you know, in line with Frankie's aesthetic up to that point. Yeah. And I remember coming out and, you know, standing there in front of Brian and costume team, and he looked at me, and here I go, never working with Brian Elsley again. I doubt he'd want to see me after I say this. But he looked at me and he said, "I'm bored, make it sexy." And like that, my character just changed. And suddenly I was presented with scripts where I didn't recognise the character that I was playing anymore.
It seems like the over-sexualization of teenagers wasn't just affecting societal perceptions in general, but it was directly affecting the creators of the show. It's like the producers just forgot that they were dealing with real teenagers because they were so used to seeing these actors in compromising positions. And Dakota is not the only one. A lot of other actors have expressed similar experiences working on the show. So, realistic casting may not be the way to go, at least when it comes to shows that include, shall we say, sensitive topics. But what about wholesome shows? I mean, there's no sex, drugs, and rock and roll on Nickelodeon.
I guess you're gonna miss the panty raid.
For the most part. Now, the obvious rebuttal to that would be, look at all of these former Disney stars who have gone off the deep end, but that's actually just a symptom of the problem. The actual problem here is a little something called Dan Schneider. Okay, so Dan Schneider isn't the entire problem, but he's a very good example of like the worst case scenario here. Now, if you don't know Dan Schneider, you definitely know his work, and if you're around my age, it's very likely that he's responsible for your favorite Nickelodeon show. Dan Schneider is a writer and producer who created content for Nickelodeon starting in the early 90s, going all the way up to 2018 when Nickelodeon decided not to renew their contract with him. His name is on some of the most iconic Nickelodeon shows, including The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Victorious, Zoe 101, iCarly. These shows have a lot of similarities, but one that you might not have noticed until it was pointed out to you is the striking amount of screen time given to feet, particularly the feet of the young actresses. I think this flew under the radar for so long because the brand of humor in these shows is very much random is funny, and I mean, let's be honest, feet are pretty random, and I can see how a kid would think that's funny, but when you pair it with Dan Schneider's public comments, the jokes become a lot less innocent. Now, I will point out that there was an investigation done by the network, and they found no evidence of sexual misconduct. The worst they could say is that many found Schneider to be verbally abusive, but he has continued to deny all of these allegations. But discovering whether or not Schneider is the Quentin Tarantino of children's television is not the point of this video. I'm really trying to make a larger point about the potential for harm that having children in entertainment possesses. Even if there was no malintent with the feet stuff, that doesn't change the fact that they broadcasted these children's feet to a national audience on several occasions. It doesn't change the fact that Jeanette McCurdy had an eating disorder at 13 years old, and it doesn't change the fact that Alexa Nicholas was bullied off the set of Zoe 101. Now, are the producers of these shows directly responsible for these harms? No. But I'd at least say that they're culpable in perpetuating the system that allows this to happen. And until the system is reformed, children are not going to be safe on a large scale in Hollywood. Okay, so maybe we should just stick with casting adults. I mean, kids are too expensive anyways. It's far more cost effective to just break every hour for the actors to shave their 5 o'clock shadow. But that brings us back to the original problem of imposing unrealistic standards onto teenagers. So where do we go from here? Well, just because you're not going to cast a teenager doesn't mean that you have to go and cast a 30-year-old. An actor who's closer to 20 is probably going to be passable as a teenager, both in appearance and performance. Although, that's because, like, a 20-year-old is still a child. Sorry, all of you 40-year-old men who think it's okay to date 20-year-olds. But the point being that the worry of the traumatization and exploitation of children is still gonna be there with those younger actors. So, what are we supposed to do to get us out of this terrible loop? Well, the industry could use a lot of reforms, but that's not exactly the actionable solution that I promised you today. No, what I'm going to propose is what everything on this channel boils down to. The writing. I mean, come on, you had to know that one was coming. Why are we so obsessed with stories about teenagers? I hate to break it to you guys, but they're not that interesting. In fact, they're so uninteresting that writers have had to embellish them so that they no longer look, sound, or act like teenagers anymore. Like I said, the amount of teenagers who are out drinking and partying and having sex while their parents are mysteriously absent is very few. In fact, this behavior sounds a lot more like a different group of youths. What group of teenagers can you think of that is notorious for drinking and parties, that still goes to school, and is not under parental supervision? It's college kids. So many problems could be solved if you just made these characters college kids. Think about Riverdale. What would fundamentally change about Riverdale if the characters were students at Riverdale Community College? I can't really think of anything. I mean, you could still have your school dances in the context of sorority formals, you could still have your neon diner, and you could even have your evil parents within driving distance of the campus. You could even have the exact same cast because that's the actual age range of those actors. The only difference is that it's infinitely less creepy to watch a shower sex scene between two college kids rather than two 16-year-olds. I feel like you could fix any problematic TV show featuring teens with this solution. Like, seriously, try it. And it's so obvious that I don't understand why it's not a more widely used tactic. I'll ask again. Why are we so obsessed with stories about teenagers? Surprise, I know the answer. I've known the answer this entire time because I wrote this video. There's an article on Medium by Eloise Stark called The Psychological Reason Adults Are Obsessed with High School Dramas, and she breaks down this phenomenon into 3 basic points. The first is nostalgia. Most of the people creating, writing, and eventually watching these shows are far enough removed from their teenage years that it's not painful or embarrassing to relive them. Now, that's obviously not going to be true for everyone, but even if you had or are having a traumatic teenagehood, these shows are a great opportunity to rewrite that experience and live vicariously through the characters. Her second point is that high school is a breeding ground for drama, which is the basis for any good TV show. You know, high schoolers with their underdeveloped brains, they'll make drama out of anything, and that's kind of what you need to keep a TV show going season after season. It's a bit harder when you have adult characters because the audience expects them to act like, well, adults, and it's a lot harder to make mountains out of your molehills. Stark's final point is that we're all still teenagers deep down. She says, when you're a teenager, you believe that eventually your doubts and insecurities will disappear. You'll know what you want to be when you grow up. Things will become clearer. Being an adult is realizing that things never do fully come into focus, that living with doubt is the only life possible. And I think she's right. I mean, the roots of all stories are based on a few universal experiences, you know, love, loss, identity, curiosity, and these things are true whether you're 17 or 70. Now, these are all pretty good explanations, but there is a piece of this that I think we're missing, which is that American culture is obsessed with youth, and so it stands to reason that our media would reflect that. And the reason we're so obsessed with youth is an entirely separate video that I will leave to someone far smarter than myself. But a basic overview is that we're sexist and we think that women have no value once they're past the age where they can make babies or be attractive to men, and we're also a capitalist hellscape where we think that you have no value if you can't be a part of the workforce. Hence, the young hot people these shows are focused on. Stark's original 3 points are definitely correct, but they portray a more wholesome and unproblematic view of these teen dramas, which just isn't true. But my proposed solution of changing the setting to college would still satisfy these interests. Maybe college isn't as much of a universal experience as high school, but I would argue that it's more of a universal experience than, you know, fighting monsters, solving murder mysteries, or living on the Upper East Side. So if you're writing one of these shows that are set in high school, maybe ask yourself if aging up the characters to college would fundamentally change anything about your show. And if your story does require a high school setting, just make sure you're taking the responsibility of that depiction seriously. Despite what it may sound like, there are shows that have done this well before. Sex Education is a great example. The high school setting is totally justified because that is the time where sex education is happening, or should be happening. Due to the subject matter, it wouldn't have been appropriate to cast actual teenagers in these roles, but I think Rosa Diaz, the costume designer, not the Brooklyn Nine-Nine character, did a great job of aging down these characters to be believable teenagers. This looks much closer to an actual teenager than these characters who are dressed up in designer clothes and heels just to go to high school. It feels like they really paid attention to how these actors would be perceived by both younger and older audiences. Younger audiences aren't comparing themselves to a Gigi Hadid lookalike, and older audiences aren't getting the opportunity to sexualize teenage characters because the sex scenes are totally non-gratuitous. In fact, they're actually educational, like more educational than the American school system. But that's not really saying much. It feels like there's this attitude among everyone really that if you can't do something perfectly, then you shouldn't even try at all, but that's just a cop-out. I mean, even if you can't be as perfect as Sex Education, putting in a little time and care will always yield better results than not trying at all. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed listening to me talk about this topic. It's one that I've heard discussed a lot recently, but I haven't really heard it discussed from a fixing it perspective. And I think as writers, we really are in a unique position where we can actually make a change by ourselves. Obviously, we need someone to produce the work that we write, but people are producing what we are making. And so we are kind of the front lines on this. And, even if it's just one story that gets told, I think that's better. I mean, Lori Nunn, who wrote Sex Education, now has an entire following behind her, and she has set an example for other people to follow in the future. And that's incredibly valuable. So I would just encourage everyone moving forward to really be thinking critically about the media that they're watching and how people are being represented in that media, especially teenagers. And yeah, that's it. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.